James Morrison had been standing at his post for 3 hours when the black Range Rover pulled up to the palace gates. The morning mist still clung to the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle, and the autumn air carried the scent of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. At 28 years old, James had served as a royal protection officer for 6 years, and he had seen enough royal arrivals to recognize the subtle differences in each one's approach. This morning felt different, though. There was a tension in the air that he couldn't quite place his finger on. The usual protocols were being followed, but something in the way the security detail moved suggested this wasn't just another routine visit. James adjusted his earpiece and checked his watch again. The Queen's schedule had been modified twice in the past hour, which was unusual for such an organized household. The Range Rover's engine purred to a stop, and James watched as the driver stepped out first, followed by 2 additional security personnel. Then the rear door opened, and Camilla, the Queen Consort, emerged with her characteristic composed smile. She was dressed in a cream-colored coat with pearl accessories, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Behind her came a small entourage of staff members, including what appeared to be a photography crew. James had interacted with Camilla on several occasions during his tenure. She had always been polite but distant, treating the security staff with the kind of professional courtesy that maintained clear boundaries between royalty and those who served them. Today, however, there was something different in her demeanor. She seemed more animated, more purposeful than usual, as if she had a specific agenda beyond her normal royal duties. The photography crew began unloading their equipment with practiced efficiency. James recognized some of the faces from previous royal events, but there were also several new people he didn't recognize. This struck him as odd because security protocols typically required advance clearance for all personnel involved in royal photography, especially on palace grounds. He made a mental note to verify the credentials of the unfamiliar faces. As Camilla approached the entrance, she paused and turned toward James's position. Their eyes met briefly, and he offered the standard respectful nod that protocol required. Instead of the usual acknowledgement and continuation of her journey, Camilla diverted from her path and walked directly toward him. This was highly unusual. Royal family members rarely initiated direct contact with security personnel unless there was a specific security concern or emergency. "Good morning, Officer Morrison," she said, her voice carrying that distinctive upper-class accent that had become so familiar to the British public over the years. "I trust you're having a pleasant morning at your post." James straightened his posture and responded with the appropriate formality. "Good morning, Your Majesty. Yes, thank you. Everything is secure and proceeding normally." Camilla's smile broadened slightly, but there was something in her expression that James found difficult to read. It wasn't quite warmth, but it wasn't entirely cold either. It was the look of someone who was about to make a request and was gauging the likelihood of compliance before making it. "I'm having some photographs taken today for a new charity initiative," she explained, gesturing toward the photography crew who were now setting up their equipment near the castle's main entrance. "The lighting near your post would be absolutely perfect for some of the shots we need. Would it be possible for you to step aside for perhaps 30 minutes while we work in that area?" The request caught James off guard. In his 6 years of service, he had never been asked to abandon his post for a photography session. Security protocols were extremely clear about maintaining positions during royal visits, regardless of the circumstances. The areas around key entrances were considered critical security zones, and leaving them unmanned was strictly prohibited without explicit authorization from his commanding officer. "Your Majesty," James replied carefully, "I would need to receive authorization from my supervisor before leaving this position. Security protocols require that all entrances remain monitored at all times during royal visits." Camilla's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The smile remained, but there was a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested his response wasn't what she had hoped to hear. "Surely we can make an exception for something so brief. It's really just a few photographs for charity work, nothing that would compromise security." James felt the weight of the moment settling on him. He was caught between his training, which demanded strict adherence to security protocols, and a direct request from a member of the royal family. In the hierarchy of the royal household, Camilla's position was certainly significant, but security protocols existed precisely to prevent situations where personal preferences could override safety considerations. The photography crew had noticed the conversation taking place and had paused their setup to observe. James could feel their eyes on him, along with those of Camilla's staff members who had positioned themselves nearby. The pressure to comply was obvious, but his training had prepared him for exactly these kinds of situations, where protocol might be challenged by seemingly reasonable requests. "Your Majesty," he said, maintaining his respectful tone while standing firm in his position. "I understand the importance of your charity work, and I'm certain we can find a solution that doesn't require abandoning this security position. Perhaps we could coordinate with the photography crew to work around the current security arrangements, or we could request authorization from my commanding officer to temporarily adjust the security layout." The pause that followed felt much longer than it actually was. Camilla's staff members exchanged glances, and James could sense their discomfort with the situation. In royal circles, direct refusals, even polite ones, were rare occurrences. The expectation was, generally, that royal requests would be accommodated without question, particularly for something that seemed as harmless as a charity photo shoot. Camilla's response, when it came, was measured but carried an unmistakable edge. "Officer Morrison, I appreciate your dedication to protocol, but I think you may be overcomplicating what is really a very simple request. We're not asking you to compromise security, merely to be flexible in service of important charitable work." James recognized the subtle shift in tone. This was no longer a polite request between acquaintances. It was becoming a test of wills between authority figures operating within different systems of power. His training had covered these scenarios, though experiencing one in real time felt much more intense than any simulation or classroom discussion had suggested it would be. "Your Majesty," he replied, "my responsibility is to ensure the security of all royal family members and palace grounds, according to established protocols. These protocols exist to protect everyone involved, including yourself. I would be happy to contact my supervisor immediately to discuss alternatives that would meet both your needs and security requirements." The mention of involving his supervisor seemed to trigger something in Camilla's demeanor. Her composed smile faltered slightly, and for a moment James caught a glimpse of genuine frustration beneath the carefully maintained royal facade. It was clear that she had expected this to be a simple matter of making a request and having it fulfilled without question or complication. The photographer, a middle-aged man with an expensive-looking camera around his neck, approached cautiously. "Your Majesty, perhaps we could explore some alternative angles that wouldn't require moving the security officer. I'm sure we can make the current setup work beautifully." Camilla turned toward the photographer with a sharp look that suggested his intervention wasn't welcome. "The lighting and background composition near Officer Morrison's post are specifically what we need for this particular series of photographs. They're intended to convey a sense of security and stability, with the palace architecture providing the proper context." James realized that he had unwittingly become part of the artistic vision for the photo shoot. The idea of using a uniformed security officer as a backdrop for royal charitable imagery struck him as somewhat inappropriate, though he kept this opinion to himself. His presence was meant to provide actual security, not serve as a prop for public relations photography. The situation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for everyone involved. Camilla's staff members were clearly uncertain about how to proceed, caught between their employer's wishes and the obvious resistance they were encountering from someone who was, technically, doing his job exactly as he was supposed to. The photography crew continued their preparations, but with obvious hesitation about how to proceed given the unresolved conflict over location. James made a decision to try to diffuse the tension while maintaining his position. "Your Majesty, would it be acceptable if I contacted my supervisor right now to explain the situation and request guidance? This would ensure that we're following proper procedures while also exploring every possible option to accommodate your photography needs." Before Camilla could respond, another voice entered the conversation. "Is there a problem here?" The voice belonged to Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Collins, James's immediate supervisor, who had approached from the direction of the main palace entrance. Her timing couldn't have been better from James's perspective, though he wondered if she had been monitoring the situation from a distance. Camilla turned to address the newcomer with renewed composure. "Detective Chief Inspector, I was just explaining to Officer Morrison that we need to use the area near his post for some important charity photography. He seems concerned about security protocols, which I certainly appreciate, but I'm sure we can find a reasonable accommodation." DCI Collins looked between Camilla and James, clearly assessing the situation quickly. "Your Majesty, I appreciate your understanding of our security concerns. Let me review the current security arrangement and see what options we might have for temporarily adjusting coverage in this area. James felt a wave of relief as his supervisor took control of the situation. DCI Collins had 20 years of experience in royal protection and was skilled at navigating the complex dynamics between security requirements and royal preferences. Her presence meant that the decision would be made at the appropriate authority level, removing the burden from James's shoulders. The primary concern, DCI Collins continued, is that this entrance requires continuous monitoring during royal visits. However, if we can coordinate with the Central Security Office to provide alternative coverage, we might be able to accommodate a brief photo shoot in this location. Camilla's expression brightened considerably. That sounds like an excellent solution. I'm sure a brief adjustment to accommodate charitable work wouldn't present any serious security concerns. James watched as DCI Collins pulled out her radio to contact the Central Security Office. The conversation that followed was brief and professional, but James could tell from his supervisor's tone and body language that the response wasn't entirely positive. When she finished the radio conversation, her expression was apologetic but firm. Your Majesty, I've spoken with the Security Coordination Office, and unfortunately we don't have additional personnel available this morning to provide alternative coverage for this position. All security officers are currently assigned to critical posts, and we can't safely create gaps in our coverage pattern. The disappointment on Camilla's face was obvious, though she attempted to maintain her composure. Surely there must be some way to accommodate what amounts to less than 30 minutes of photography for charitable purposes. Officer Morrison could remain nearby, just not directly in the frame. DCI Collins shook her head gently. The protocols are quite specific about maintaining sight lines and positioning during royal visits. Even a small adjustment in Officer Morrison's position could compromise his ability to monitor this entrance effectively. James could see that the situation was reaching a critical point. Camilla was clearly frustrated with what she perceived as excessive rigidity in the face of a reasonable request. Her staff members were becoming increasingly uncomfortable, and the photography crew was standing by with expensive equipment, unable to proceed with their planned shoot. What happened next would become the moment that defined this entire encounter, though none of them could have predicted it at the time. The silence that followed DCI Collins's explanation stretched uncomfortably long. James could feel the weight of multiple gazes upon him, and he sensed that this moment would be remembered and discussed long after the morning's events had concluded. The autumn wind picked up slightly, rustling the fallen leaves around their feet and adding an almost theatrical element to the tense standoff. Camilla took a step closer to where James stood at his post, her eyes fixed directly on his face. When she spoke, her voice had changed completely from the polite, measured tone she had maintained throughout their previous exchange. There was something raw and unfiltered in her words that caught everyone present off guard. "Officer Morrison," she said, her voice carrying a sharp edge that seemed to cut through the morning air, "I think you need to understand something about your position here. You work for this institution, and this institution serves the royal family. When I make a reasonable request for a brief accommodation, your job is to find ways to make it happen, not to hide behind regulations and procedures." James felt his pulse quicken, but his training kept him steady. He had encountered difficult situations before, though never quite like this one. The directness of Camilla's challenge was unprecedented in his experience with royal family members. Even in moments of frustration or disagreement, there was usually a layer of formal politeness that was maintained. This felt different, more personal somehow. DCI Collins stepped forward slightly, clearly concerned about the direction the conversation was taking. "Your Majesty, Officer Morrison is following established security protocols that exist to ensure everyone's safety. These procedures aren't arbitrary. They're based on years of experience and careful risk assessment." Camilla turned her attention to DCI Collins, but her frustration was still clearly focused on James. "Detective Chief Inspector, I understand the importance of security, but what I'm seeing here is inflexibility disguised as professionalism. A truly competent security officer would find creative solutions to accommodate legitimate royal needs, not simply refuse to consider alternatives." The criticism stung partly because James took genuine pride in his professionalism and competence. He had received commendations for his service, and his performance reviews had consistently praised his judgment and dedication. To have his abilities questioned in front of his supervisor and colleagues felt like a personal attack rather than a professional disagreement. "Your Majesty," James replied, his voice remaining steady despite the internal pressure he felt. "My primary responsibility is ensuring your safety and the security of palace grounds. Every decision I make is guided by that responsibility. I would never refuse a request out of mere inflexibility. Any hesitation comes from genuine security concerns." The photographer, who had been watching this exchange with growing alarm, attempted once again to intervene. "Perhaps I could scout some alternative locations that might work just as well for the charitable photography. I'm sure we can find something that meets both the artistic requirements and security needs." Camilla's response was swift and dismissive. The location requirements were specifically chosen for this project. We're not looking for something that might work just as well. We need exactly what we asked for, and what we asked for is perfectly reasonable. Her staff members were now exchanging worried glances among themselves. James could see that they recognized the situation was escalating beyond normal royal protocol. In the carefully choreographed world of royal engagements, public displays of frustration were rare and generally considered problematic for all parties involved. One of Camilla's private secretaries, a woman in her 50s whom James recognized from previous visits, stepped forward cautiously. "Your Majesty, perhaps we could schedule the photography for a different time when security arrangements might be more flexible." The suggestion seemed to trigger an even stronger reaction from Camilla. "Margaret, we scheduled this specifically for today because of the lighting conditions and the charity's timeline requirements. Rescheduling isn't an option, and it shouldn't be necessary to accommodate what amounts to basic cooperation from palace staff." James noticed that Camilla had referred to him as palace staff, rather than using his title or acknowledging his role as a security officer. The subtle diminishment felt deliberate, as if she was attempting to reframe the interaction as a simple matter of employee insubordination rather than a legitimate security concern. DCI Collins must have picked up on the same subtle shift in language because her own tone became more formal and protective. "Your Majesty, Officer Morrison is following precise security protocols that are established for the protection of all royal family members. These protocols don't distinguish between different types of royal requests. They're designed to maintain consistent security standards regardless of circumstances." "Detective Chief Inspector," Camilla replied, her voice now carrying clear irritation, "I think you're missing the point here. This isn't about security protocols in general. It's about one individual's unwillingness to show appropriate flexibility when faced with a simple, reasonable request from a member of the royal family." The personal nature of the criticism was becoming impossible to ignore. James realized that what had started as a procedural disagreement had somehow transformed into something much more personal. He wasn't sure exactly when or how the shift had occurred, but it was clear that Camilla's frustration was now directed specifically at him rather than at the security system in general. "Your Majesty," James said carefully, "I want to assure you that my response has nothing to do with unwillingness to accommodate royal needs. If there were any way to fulfill your request while maintaining security standards, I would be happy to do so. My concern is purely professional, based on my training and experience." Camilla studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether his explanation was genuine or simply a more polished version of what she perceived as defiance. When she spoke again, her words would be remembered by everyone present for years to come. "Officer Morrison, I think the problem here is that you don't understand your place in this institution. You seem to believe that your job is to make decisions about royal requests, when in fact your job is to facilitate them. The royal family doesn't need security officers who think they know better than we do about what's appropriate or necessary." The words hung in the air like a challenge. James felt the eyes of everyone present focused on him, waiting to see how he would respond to such a direct confrontation. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but nothing had quite prepared him for having his professional competence and institutional understanding questioned so directly by a member of the royal family. DCI Collins moved to intervene again, but James raised his hand slightly to indicate that he wanted to respond himself. He had reached a point where he felt the need to clarify his position, not just for Camilla but for everyone present who would witness and remember this interaction. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I believe I understand my position very clearly. My job is to ensure your safety and the security of royal residences. That responsibility sometimes requires making difficult decisions, even when they may be inconvenient or frustrating for others. I take that responsibility seriously because the consequences of security failures extend far beyond mere inconvenience. The directness of his response seemed to surprise Camilla. In her experience, palace staff typically responded to criticism with apologies and promises to find alternative solutions, not with explanations of why their original position was correct. James's unwillingness to back down appeared to trigger something deeper than mere frustration with the morning's photography plans. "Officer Morrison," she said, her voice now carrying a cold edge that made everyone present uncomfortable. "I think you've made your position quite clear. You've decided that your interpretation of security requirements is more important than accommodating legitimate royal needs. That's a very interesting perspective for someone in your position." James felt the implicit threat in her words, though she had been careful not to make any explicit statements about consequences or future implications. The message was clear enough. His refusal to accommodate her request would be remembered and potentially used against him in some future context. The photographer had finished packing up his equipment, apparently recognizing that the photoshoot was not going to happen as originally planned. Camilla's staff members were clearly eager to move away from the uncomfortable confrontation and proceed with other scheduled activities. The entire scene had taken on an awkward, unpleasant atmosphere that everyone wanted to escape. But Camilla wasn't quite finished. As she prepared to leave, she turned back to James one final time, and what she said next would become the most talked-about moment of the entire encounter. "You know, Officer Morrison," she said, her voice carrying a distinctly personal tone, "I've been thinking about this situation, and I believe the real issue here isn't security protocols at all. The real issue is that some people in this institution have difficulty accepting authority when it comes from certain members of the royal family." The implication was unmistakable. Though Camilla had been careful to express it indirectly, James felt a surge of anger at what seemed like a deliberate attempt to reframe his professional decision as some kind of personal bias or prejudice. The suggestion that his adherence to security protocols was motivated by anything other than professional duty felt like a fundamental misrepresentation of his character and intentions. DCI Collins stepped forward immediately. "Your Majesty, I can assure you that Officer Morrison's response today has been entirely professional and consistent with his training and protocols. Any suggestion otherwise would be unfair and inaccurate." Camilla's smile returned, but it was cold and humorless. "Detective Chief Inspector, I'm sure you believe that. But sometimes the people closest to a situation are the least able to see it clearly." As the group began to move away from James's position, he heard Camilla make one final comment to her private secretary, spoken just loudly enough that he was clearly meant to overhear it. The words would echo in his mind long after the morning's events had concluded, and would eventually become the central focus of media attention when the story eventually became public. "Margaret," Camilla said as they walked away, "make a note about today's interaction. I think it's important that we remember which members of the palace staff are willing to work with us and which ones seem to have other priorities." James remained at his post, watching as the group disappeared into the palace. The morning had started like any other, but he sensed that something fundamental had changed in his relationship with the royal household. What had begun as a simple procedural disagreement had somehow transformed into something much more personal and potentially damaging. DCI Collins approached him once Camilla's group was out of earshot. "James, you handled that exactly as you should have. Don't let the personal comments get to you. You followed protocol perfectly, and that's exactly what you're trained to do." But even as his supervisor offered reassurance, James could see concern in her eyes. They both understood that this interaction would not be easily forgotten or dismissed. In the hierarchical world of royal service, conflicts with senior members of the royal family rarely ended with a simple disagreement. There were usually consequences, sometimes immediate and sometimes delayed, but almost always present in some form. As James continued his watch, he found himself replaying the conversation over and over in his mind, trying to understand how a routine photography request had escalated into such a personal confrontation. What troubled him most wasn't Camilla's obvious frustration with his decision, but rather the way the disagreement had seemed to tap into something deeper and more personal than the immediate circumstances warranted. The morning sun had burned away the earlier mist, and Windsor Castle stood clear and imposing against the autumn sky. James's post remained secure, his duties unchanged, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his career had just taken a significant and potentially problematic turn. The conversation with Camilla had revealed something about the complex dynamics of royal service that his training had never fully prepared him for, and he suspected that the full implications of the morning's events were yet to be revealed. 3 days had passed since the confrontation with Camilla, and James Morrison was beginning to think that perhaps the incident would be forgotten among the countless daily interactions that occurred within the royal household. He had returned to his regular rotation of duties, maintaining his professional demeanor and focusing on the security responsibilities that had defined his career for the past 6 years. The first sign that the situation was far from over came during his regular briefing session with DCI Collins on Thursday morning. Instead of their usual discussion about security schedules and protocol updates, his supervisor's expression was serious and somewhat strained when he entered her office. "James, sit down," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "We need to discuss some developments related to Monday's incident with the Queen Consort." James felt his stomach tighten, though he tried to maintain his composure. "Has there been some kind of formal complaint filed?" DCI Collins shook her head, but her expression didn't become any less serious. "Not exactly a complaint, but there have been inquiries. The Queen Consort's private office has been asking questions about security protocols, specifically about decision-making authority during royal visits and the process for accommodating special requests." The careful language told James everything he needed to know. While no direct action was being taken against him, his handling of Monday's situation was clearly under review by people with the power to affect his career significantly. In the world of royal service, such inquiries were rarely casual or without purpose. "What kind of questions specifically?" James asked, though he suspected he already knew the general direction of the inquiries. "They're asking about the chain of command for security decisions, about training protocols for interacting with royal family members, and about procedures for handling situations where security requirements might conflict with royal preferences," DCI Collins explained. "On the surface, these seem like reasonable questions about operational procedures, but the timing and the specific focus suggest they're really about Monday's incident." James nodded, understanding the implications. "Are they questioning whether I followed proper procedures?" "Not directly," his supervisor replied, "but they are exploring whether our current procedures are adequately flexible and whether our training properly prepares officers to balance security requirements with royal needs. The subtext seems to be that Monday's situation could have been handled differently." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. DCI Collins called for the visitor to enter, and James was surprised to see Detective Superintendent Richard Hayes, the head of Royal Protection Services. His presence in a routine briefing meeting was unusual and suggested that Monday's incident had attracted attention at the highest levels of the security organization. "Good morning, James," Superintendent Hayes said as he took a seat. "Sarah has briefed me on Monday's situation, and I wanted to speak with you directly about what happened." James straightened in his chair, recognizing that this conversation would likely be much more significant than his regular briefings with DCI Collins. Superintendent Hayes was known for his careful approach to the political complexities of royal protection, and his involvement suggested that Monday's incident was being treated as more than a simple procedural disagreement. "Sir, I'm happy to answer any questions about my actions on Monday. I believe I followed established security protocols correctly, but I'm certainly open to feedback about how the situation could have been handled better." Superintendent Hayes nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of response I hope to hear from you, James. Let me be clear from the start. From a security standpoint, your actions were entirely appropriate. You followed your training, you consulted with your supervisor when appropriate, and you maintained the security integrity of your assigned position." James felt a moment of relief, but he could sense that there was more to come. "However," the superintendent continued, "we operate in an environment where security requirements must coexist with royal preferences and institutional needs. Sometimes, even when we're technically correct, we need to consider whether our approach serves the broader interests of effective royal protection." The carefully diplomatic language revealed the delicate balance that Superintendent Hayes was trying to maintain. James understood that he was being told that his actions were professionally correct but potentially problematic from a political perspective within the royal household. "Sir, could you help me understand what alternative approach might have been more appropriate? I'm genuinely interested in learning from this situation, but I'm not sure how I could have maintained security standards while also accommodating the photography request. DCI Collins leaned forward. James, I think the issue isn't necessarily about what you decided, but rather about how the decision was communicated and the impression it created about our willingness to work with royal preferences when possible. Superintendent Hayes nodded in agreement. Exactly. The Queen Consort's office isn't questioning your ultimate decision, but they are concerned about what they perceive as inflexibility in the decision-making process. They feel that alternative solutions weren't adequately explored before the request was declined. James felt a surge of frustration, though he was careful not to let it show in his expression. Sir, with respect, we did explore alternatives. DCI Collins contacted the Central Security Office to investigate additional coverage options, and when those weren't available, we explained why the request couldn't be accommodated. I'm not sure what additional alternatives we could have considered. The two senior officers exchanged a glance that suggested they had anticipated this response and had already discussed how to address it. James, Superintendent Hayes said gently, sometimes in situations like this, the process is as important as the outcome. Royal family members need to feel that their requests are taken seriously and that every possible option is thoroughly explored before they're told something can't be done. Even when the ultimate answer has to be no, the way that answer is reached and communicated can make a significant difference in how it's received. The explanation made sense from a diplomatic perspective, but James still struggled to understand what he should have done differently in practical terms. The security requirements had been clear, the alternatives had been limited, and the decision had been made at the appropriate authority level. Sir, I appreciate the feedback, and I want to learn from this situation. Could you give me some specific guidance about how I should handle similar situations in the future? I want to make sure I'm balancing security requirements with diplomatic considerations effectively. Superintendent Hayes smiled for the first time during the conversation. That's exactly the kind of question that tells me you're approaching this with the right attitude, James. Here's what I want you to consider. When royal family members make requests that conflict with standard security protocols, your first response should be to explore creative solutions rather than to explain why the request can't be accommodated. DCI Collins picked up the explanation. For example, in Monday's situation, you might have suggested alternative timing, alternative positioning for the photographer, or alternative security arrangements that could have made the photo shoot possible while maintaining adequate protection. Even if those alternatives ultimately proved unworkable, the royal family would have seen that you were genuinely trying to find solutions. James considered this feedback carefully. It made sense from a customer service perspective, though. He wondered whether such an approach might sometimes raise false expectations or delay necessary security decisions. Still, he could see how Monday's interaction might have felt dismissive to Camilla, even though that hadn't been his intention. I understand the principle, he said. My concern is that in security situations there's often pressure to make quick decisions, and exploring multiple alternatives could sometimes delay responses in ways that might compromise security. How do I balance those concerns? Good question, Superintendent Hayes replied. The key is to distinguish between situations that require immediate security decisions and situations where there's time for more diplomatic problem-solving. Monday's photography request wasn't an emergency security situation. There was time to explore options more thoroughly and to involve additional people in finding solutions. The conversation was interrupted by another knock on the door. This time, the visitor was someone James didn't recognize. A woman in her 40s wearing the kind of expensive, conservative business attire that suggested she worked in the administrative side of the royal household rather than in security. Superintendent Hayes, she said as she entered. I apologize for interrupting, but the Queen Consort's private secretary has requested an update on the security protocol review. Should I tell her that the discussion is ongoing? The presence of someone from the Queen Consort's office made the political dimensions of the situation crystal clear to James. This wasn't simply an internal security review. It was a response to pressure from Camilla's staff, who were clearly monitoring the situation closely. Superintendent Hayes stood up. Please tell the private secretary that we're conducting a thorough review of Monday's incident and will provide a comprehensive report by the end of the week. We're committed to ensuring that our security protocols appropriately balance protection requirements with royal operational needs. After the woman left, Superintendent Hayes turned back to James with an expression that was both sympathetic and serious. James, I want you to understand the broader context here. The Queen Consort's office is asking questions about this incident, but they're not demanding your dismissal or formal disciplinary action. What they want is assurance that similar situations will be handled differently in the future. DCI Collins added, "The reality is that your career in royal protection depends not just on following security protocols correctly, but also on maintaining positive working relationships with the royal family. Monday's incident has created some tension in that relationship, and we need to address it constructively." James felt the weight of the situation settling on him more heavily than before. While he wasn't facing immediate consequences, it was clear that his future in royal protection would depend on his ability to navigate the complex political dynamics that Monday's incident had revealed. "Sir, what specifically do you need from me to address the concerns that have been raised?" he asked. Superintendent Hayes sat back down and looked directly at James. "First, I want you to write a detailed report about Monday's incident, including your assessment of how the situation could have been handled differently. Second, I'm arranging for you to attend some additional training sessions on diplomatic communication and conflict resolution in royal service context." The additional training wasn't being presented as punishment, but James understood that it was a way of demonstrating to the Queen Court's office that corrective action was being taken. It was also a signal that his approach to similar situations in the future would be closely monitored. Additionally, DCI Collins said, "We're going to modify security protocols to include more explicit guidance about exploring alternative solutions when royal requests conflict with standard procedures. Your experience on Monday has highlighted a gap in our training that needs to be addressed." James appreciated that his supervisors were framing the situation as a learning opportunity for the entire security organization rather than as a personal failure on his part. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being made responsible for systemic tensions between security requirements and royal preferences that extended far beyond Monday's specific incident. As the meeting concluded, Superintendent Hayes offered one final piece of advice. "James, you have an excellent record as a protection officer, and this incident doesn't change that. But royal protection requires more than just technical competence. It requires the ability to manage complex relationships with people who have very different perspectives on security and very different expectations about how they should be treated. Monday was a learning experience for all of us about how to balance those requirements more effectively." Walking back to his duty station, James reflected on the conversation and its implications for his career. While he had avoided immediate consequences, it was clear that Monday's incident had created lasting complications that would influence his future in royal protection. The feedback he had received was reasonable and well-intentioned, but it also revealed the extent to which his job required navigating political considerations that weren't always aligned with straightforward security requirements. The most troubling aspect of the situation was the sense that no matter how professionally he performed his duties, his career success would ultimately depend on factors beyond his control, specifically on the personal reactions of royal family members to his decisions. Monday's incident had taught him that even technically correct decisions could become career-limiting events if they were perceived as insufficiently accommodating by the wrong people. As he resumed his regular duties, James found himself second-guessing decisions and interactions that would have seemed routine just a few days earlier. The confidence that came from clear protocols and consistent training had been replaced by uncertainty about how to balance competing demands that might not have clear or consistent solutions. The afternoon passed without incident, but James couldn't shake the feeling that Monday's confrontation with Camilla had fundamentally changed his relationship with royal protection work. What had once seemed like a straightforward career focused on professional security work now felt like a much more complex and potentially treacherous navigation of personal relationships and institutional politics. 2 weeks after the initial incident, James Morrison thought he had successfully navigated the diplomatic aftermath of his confrontation with Camilla. He had completed his written report, attended the additional training sessions on royal protocol, and received positive feedback from his supervisors about his willingness to learn from the experience. The extra scrutiny on his work had gradually diminished, and his daily routine had returned to something approaching normal. That sense of normalcy ended abruptly on a Tuesday morning when he arrived at work to find DCI Collins waiting for him with an expression that immediately told him something serious had happened. Instead of their usual brief morning check-in, she directed him to her office and closed the door behind them. "James, we have a problem," she said without preamble. "The Queen Consort's private office has filed a formal complaint about your conduct during the photography incident. They're alleging that your behavior was inappropriate and unprofessional, and they're requesting that you be removed from any duties that might involve interaction with the Queen Consort." The words hit James like a physical blow. After 2 weeks of what seemed like successful damage control, the situation had suddenly escalated to a level that could end his career in royal protection. The timing was particularly shocking because there had been no warning that additional action was being considered. "What specifically are they alleging?" James asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the anxiety that was building in his chest. DCI Collins consulted a document on her desk. "The complaint states that you were deliberately obstructive and disrespectful during the photography request, that you failed to show appropriate deference to royal authority, and that your overall demeanor was inappropriate for someone in a position of service to the royal family." Each allegation felt like a distortion of what had actually happened during the incident. James had been professional throughout the interaction, even when the conversation had become uncomfortable and personal. The idea that he had been deliberately obstructive seemed particularly unfair given that he had followed established security protocols throughout. "Did they provide specific examples of this alleged inappropriate behavior?" he asked. "They cite your refusal to consider reasonable alternatives and your argumentative response when the Queen Consort explained her requirements. They also mention that you lectured the Queen Consort about security procedures in a way that was condescending and inappropriate." James felt a surge of anger at the characterization of his actions. He had explained security requirements when asked, but he had never lectured anyone, and his tone throughout the interaction had remained professional, despite significant provocation. The complaint seemed to reframe his adherence to protocol as personal defiance. "Sarah, you were there for most of that conversation. Did my behavior strike you as inappropriate or disrespectful?" James asked. DCI Collins sighed deeply. "James, from my perspective, you handled the situation professionally and appropriately. You followed protocol, you consulted with supervision when needed, and you maintained your composure under pressure. But royal protection isn't just about what actually happened. It's also about how royal family members perceive what happened. The distinction between objective reality and subjective perception was one that James was beginning to understand had profound implications for his career. In royal service, the opinions of royal family members carried weight that extended far beyond normal workplace dynamics. "What happens now?" he asked. "There's going to be a formal investigation," DCI Collins replied. "Superintendent Hayes will conduct interviews with everyone who was present during the incident, review the written reports, and make a recommendation about how to proceed. The process should take about a week." James nodded, though he felt overwhelmed by the prospect of having his professional conduct subjected to such scrutiny. "Will I continue with my regular duties during the investigation?" "For now, yes, but with modifications. You won't be assigned to any posts where you might interact with the Queen Consort, and you'll be working primarily with other members of the royal family where there are no ongoing concerns about your conduct." The practical implications of these restrictions were significant. Royal protection officers built their careers by demonstrating their ability to work effectively with all members of the royal family. Being excluded from duties involving the Queen Consort would limit his opportunities for advancement and potentially signal to other royal family members that he was somehow problematic. The conversation was interrupted by a call on DCI Collins's radio. After a brief exchange with the Central Security Office, she turned back to James with another serious expression. "James, there's been another development. The Queen Consort is visiting the palace this afternoon for a scheduled engagement, and her private office has specifically requested that you not be assigned anywhere in her vicinity during the visit. Superintendent Hayes wants to see you before the visit begins." The exclusion felt like a public statement about his status within the Royal Protection Organization. Other officers would certainly notice his absence from the Queen Consort's security detail, and questions would inevitably arise about why he had been reassigned. The professional embarrassment of the situation was almost as difficult to handle as the potential career consequences. An hour later, James found himself sitting across from Superintendent Hayes in his office, along with DCI Collins and Detective Inspector Michael Thompson, who was responsible for internal affairs investigations within the Royal Protection Service. The formal nature of the meeting made it clear that this was the beginning of the official investigation process. James, Superintendent Hayes began, I want to be clear about the purpose of this meeting. We're beginning a formal investigation into the complaint that has been filed by the Queen Consort's office. This investigation will be thorough and fair, and you'll have every opportunity to present your perspective on what happened during the photography incident. Detective Inspector Thompson took over the explanation. I'll be conducting interviews with all witnesses to the incident, reviewing security footage if available, and examining all written reports and documentation related to the event. The goal is to develop a complete understanding of what happened and to make recommendations about how to proceed. James appreciated the professional tone of the investigation, though he couldn't help but feel that the outcome might be predetermined by the political realities of the situation. Complaints from senior members of the royal family rarely resulted in vindication for the staff members involved. Sir, I want to cooperate fully with the investigation, James said. I believe that a thorough review of the facts will show that my conduct was professional and appropriate throughout the incident. That's what we're here to determine, D.I. Thompson replied. I do want to ask you about one specific allegation in the Queen Consort's office states that you made comments about knowing your place during the interaction. Can you tell me about that? James was confused by the reference. Sir, I don't recall making any comments about knowing my place. In fact, it was the Queen Consort who made comments about my understanding of my position within the institution. She suggested that I didn't understand my role properly. D.I. Thompson made notes and exchanged a glance with Superintendent Hayes. That's an interesting discrepancy. The complaint suggests that you made inappropriate comments about hierarchy and authority within the royal household. The reversal of what had actually happened during the conversation was troubling. James began to realize that he might be facing not just a complaint about his behavior, but a fundamental disagreement about the basic facts of what had occurred during the photography incident. Sir, I can say with absolute certainty that I never made comments about hierarchy or anyone's place in the royal household. My comments were limited to explaining security protocols and the reasons why I couldn't accommodate the photography request. Superintendent Hayes leaned forward. James, I want you to understand that this investigation will likely come down to competing accounts of what happened during a tense and emotional conversation. The Queen Consort and her staff remember the interaction one way, and you remember it differently. Our job is to determine which account is more credible and consistent with the evidence. The political reality of the situation was becoming clear. In a dispute between a royal family member and a security officer, the burden of proof would inevitably fall on the security officer to demonstrate that their conduct had been appropriate. Royal family members enjoyed a presumption of credibility that extended beyond normal workplace dynamics. D.I. Thompson continued his questions. The complaint also mentions that you were argumentative and defensive when the Queen Consort attempted to explain her requirements. How would you characterize your responses during the conversation? I would characterize them as professional explanations of security requirements, James replied. When the Queen Consort asked questions about why her request couldn't be accommodated, I provided factual information about the protocols and procedures that governed my decision. I never argued with her. I simply explained the security considerations that were relevant to the situation. But you did refuse her request even after she explained its importance for charitable work? D.I. Thompson asked. I followed established security protocols that prohibited leaving my assigned post unmanned during royal visits. The refusal wasn't personal. It was procedural. If the same request had come from any other member of the royal family, or from any other person, the response would have been identical. Superintendent Hayes made additional notes. James, help me understand your perspective on the tone and atmosphere of the conversation. Did you sense that the Queen Consort was becoming frustrated or upset? Yes, sir. It was clear that she was frustrated with the situation. But I believe her frustration was directed at the security protocols, rather than at me personally, at least initially. The conversation became more personal as it progressed, particularly when she began making comments about my understanding of my position and my competence as a security officer. D.I. Thompson looked up from his notes. According to the complaint, those comments about your position and competence were made in response to what the Queen Consort perceived as disrespectful behavior on your part. She felt that you were being dismissive of legitimate royal requirements. The circular nature of the argument was frustrating. James's adherence to protocol was being characterized as disrespectful, while Camilla's personal criticisms were being justified as responses to his alleged misconduct. The investigation seemed to be starting from the premise that the Queen Consort's perspective was correct and working backward to find evidence to support it. Sir, I respectfully disagree with that characterization. I was never dismissive of royal requirements. I explained why a specific request couldn't be accommodated due to security concerns, and I offered to work with supervision to explore alternatives. That seems like the appropriate response for a security officer in that situation. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, covering every aspect of the photography incident in detail. James answered each question honestly and thoroughly, but he left the meeting with a growing sense that the investigation's outcome might have more to do with institutional politics than with objective facts. As he walked back to his modified duty assignment, James reflected on how quickly his career had been derailed by a single interaction. 2 weeks ago, he had been a respected security officer, with an excellent record and a promising future in royal protection. Now he was under formal investigation, excluded from significant duties, and facing the possibility that his career in royal service might be over. The most troubling aspect of the situation was the realization that no amount of professional competence or adherence to protocol could protect him from the personal reactions of royal family members. His job required him to make security decisions that might sometimes conflict with royal preferences, but those same decisions could apparently be reinterpreted as evidence of inappropriate conduct if a royal family member chose to view them that way. The afternoon passed slowly as James carried out his restricted duties, acutely aware that his colleagues were beginning to notice his absence from normal assignments. By evening, he was certain that word of the investigation was spreading throughout the Royal Protection Service, and he wondered how long it would be before the story reached the media. That night, as he reviewed the day's events, James realized that the photography incident had revealed something fundamental about the nature of royal service that his training had never adequately prepared him for. The job required not just professional competence, but also the ability to navigate personal relationships with individuals who wielded enormous institutional power and who might interpret professional decisions as personal slights. The investigation would continue for several more days, but James already understood that his future in royal protection would depend less on the facts of what had happened during the photography incident than on broader questions about his ability to maintain positive relationships with royal family members who might have very different expectations about how they should be treated by palace staff. The investigation concluded on a Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after it had begun. James Morrison sat in Superintendent Hayes's office, flanked by DCI Collins and a representative from the Royal Protection Service's Human Resources Department. The formal atmosphere told him that this meeting would determine his future in royal service, and possibly his career in law enforcement, entirely. Detective Inspector Thompson had completed his interviews with all witnesses, reviewed available documentation, and prepared a comprehensive report on the photography incident. The report, which ran to 15 pages, would serve as the basis for any decisions about James's continued employment and his standing within the Royal Protection Organization. James, Superintendent Hayes began, I want to start by acknowledging the difficult position you've been in throughout this investigation. Being subject to a formal complaint is never easy, particularly when it comes from a senior member of the royal family. You've maintained your professionalism throughout this process, and that's been noted by everyone involved. The preliminary comments were encouraging, but James had enough experience with institutional communications to know that positive opening statements didn't necessarily predict favorable outcomes. In sensitive personnel situations, bad news was often delivered with extensive preamble designed to soften the impact. D.I. Thompson opened his report and began summarizing his findings. After interviewing all witnesses and reviewing available evidence, I've concluded that the events of the photography incident occurred largely as Officer Morrison described them. Security footage confirms the timeline of events, and witness statements corroborate the basic facts of what transpired during the conversation with the Queen Consort. James felt a moment of relief, but D.I. Thompson's tone suggested that the factual accuracy of his account wouldn't necessarily resolve all the issues raised by the complaint. However, Thompson continued, the investigation has also revealed significant differences in perception between Officer Morrison and the Queen Consort staff regarding the tone and appropriateness of the interaction. While Officer Morrison's actions were technically correct from a security protocol standpoint, The Queen Consort's office maintains that his approach was insufficiently accommodating and failed to adequately explore alternative solutions. The distinction between technical correctness and perceived appropriateness was one that James had been grappling with throughout the investigation. It seemed that his adherence to established protocols wasn't sufficient to protect him from criticism if those protocols produced outcomes that royal family members found unsatisfactory. Superintendent Hayes took over the explanation. The investigation has confirmed that you followed security protocols correctly and that your decision to maintain your post was justified by established procedures. However, it has also highlighted some areas where our approach to balancing security requirements with royal preferences could be improved. The Human Resources representative spoke for the first time. Officer Morrison, I want to make it clear that no formal disciplinary action will be taken against you as a result of this investigation. Your conduct during the photography incident was within the bounds of acceptable professional behavior, and there's no evidence of deliberate misconduct or violation of established policies. The relief James felt was immediate and overwhelming. While the investigation had been stressful and professionally embarrassing, he had avoided the worst possible outcomes: dismissal, formal discipline, or a permanent black mark on his record that would follow him throughout his career. However, Superintendent Hayes' expression suggested that the resolution wasn't entirely favorable. James, while you're not facing disciplinary action, the investigation has revealed some ongoing concerns about your assignment to duties involving the Queen Consort. Her office has made it clear that they would prefer not to work with you in the future, and we need to respect those preferences while also protecting your career opportunities. The practical implications of this diplomatic language were significant. Being effectively banned from working with the Queen Consort would limit James's advancement opportunities and could signal to other royal family members that he was somehow problematic or difficult to work with. Sir, I understand the political realities of the situation, James replied. But I'm concerned about the long-term impact on my career. If I'm excluded from duties involving the Queen Consort, it sends a message that could affect my relationships with other members of the royal family. D.I. Thompson nodded sympathetically. That's a legitimate concern, and it's one we've discussed extensively. Our recommendation is to handle this through careful rotation of assignments, rather than through formal restrictions. Over time, as memories of this incident fade, and as you demonstrate continued professional excellence, the situation should normalize. DCI Collins added, We're also implementing some of the training and protocol improvements that came out of this investigation. Your experience has helped identify areas where our procedures can be enhanced to better balance security requirements with royal preferences. In that sense, something positive has come out of a difficult situation. James appreciated the attempt to frame his experience as contributing to institutional improvement, but he couldn't escape the feeling that he had paid a significant personal price for revealing weaknesses in the system that should have been addressed through less painful means. The meeting continued with discussions about James's immediate assignment schedule and longer-term career planning. The consensus was that he should continue with his regular duties while avoiding situations that might bring him into direct contact with the Queen Consort. Over time, if his performance remained excellent and if no additional issues arose, the informal restrictions on his duties would gradually be relaxed. As the formal meeting concluded, Superintendent Hayes asked James to remain behind for a private conversation. Once the others had left, his tone became more personal and direct. James, I want to give you some unofficial advice about navigating your career from this point forward. The photography incident has taught all of us some important lessons about the complexities of royal protection work, and I think you can use those lessons to become an even more effective officer. James appreciated the mentoring tone, though he remained somewhat skeptical about whether any positive outcomes could truly emerge from such a difficult experience. The reality of royal protection, Superintendent Hayes continued, is that technical competence isn't enough. You also need to master the diplomatic and interpersonal aspects of the job. Royal family members are human beings with individual personalities, preferences, and sensitivities. Understanding those individual differences is just as important as understanding security protocols. The advice made sense, though James wondered whether it was possible to predict or prepare for the kind of personal dynamics that had complicated the photography incident. Camilla's reaction had seemed to go beyond normal frustration with security restrictions to something more personal and emotionally charged. Sir, I'm genuinely interested in learning from this experience, but I'm also concerned about situations where diplomatic considerations might conflict with security requirements. How do I balance those competing demands without compromising either safety or relationships? Superintendent Hayes smiled for the first time during their conversation. That's exactly the right question to ask, and it shows that you understand the complexity of the job better now than you did before the photography incident. The answer is that there's no simple formula. Each situation requires careful judgment about relative risks and benefits. He continued, "What I can tell you is that royal family members need to feel that their requests are taken seriously, and that you're genuinely trying to find solutions rather than simply citing regulations. Sometimes the process of exploring alternatives is more important than the final outcome, because it demonstrates respect for their position and requirements." The guidance was helpful, though James still struggled with the practical implications. Security decisions often needed to be made quickly and decisively, and extensive diplomatic consultations could sometimes compromise the effectiveness of protection measures. "The other thing I want you to understand," Superintendent Hayes added, "is that this investigation has actually enhanced your reputation in some important ways. You stood your ground under significant pressure, you maintained your professionalism throughout a difficult situation, and you've shown that you can handle adversity without becoming bitter or defensive. Those are valuable qualities in royal protection work." The perspective was encouraging, though James wondered whether other people in the royal household would view his experience in such positive terms. The practical reality was that he had been involved in a high-profile conflict with a senior member of the royal family, regardless of who was ultimately judged to be at fault. As James prepared to leave the meeting, Superintendent Hayes offered one final piece of advice. "The royal family works with hundreds of people every year, and conflicts like this one are more common than you might think. What matters isn't whether you occasionally find yourself in difficult situations. What matters is how you handle them and what you learn from them. Based on what I've seen over the past few weeks, I believe you'll emerge from this experience as a stronger and more effective protection officer." Walking back to his duty station, James reflected on the investigation's outcome and its implications for his future. While he had avoided formal discipline, the experience had fundamentally changed his understanding of royal protection work and the complex dynamics that governed relationships between royal family members and palace staff. The most significant insight from the entire experience was the recognition that technical competence, while necessary, wasn't sufficient for success in royal service. The job required a sophisticated understanding of individual personalities, institutional politics, and the delicate balance between professional requirements and personal relationships. In the days that followed, James noticed subtle changes in how colleagues and supervisors interacted with him. While there was no overt criticism or ostracism, there was a heightened awareness of his situation that affected the normal rhythm of professional relationships. Some colleagues seemed to view him as someone who had stood up to inappropriate pressure, while others appeared to see him as someone who had failed to manage a difficult situation diplomatically. The photography incident had become a defining moment in James's career, though not in the way he might have anticipated when he first joined the Royal Protection Service. What had started as a routine security assignment had evolved into a complex lesson about the intersection of professional duty, personal relationships, and institutional politics in one of the world's most tradition-bound organizations. 6 months later, James remained in his position as a royal protection officer, though his assignments continued to avoid direct interaction with the Queen Consort. The informal restrictions on his duties had become a permanent feature of his career, limiting his advancement opportunities but not preventing him from continuing in royal service. The incident had taught him that success in royal protection required more than following protocols and maintaining professional standards. It required an understanding of the human dynamics that shaped relationships within the royal household, and the ability to navigate those dynamics without compromising either security requirements or personal integrity. Looking back on the photography incident, James recognized it as both a professional crisis and a valuable learning experience. While he had paid a significant price for his adherence to security protocols, he had also demonstrated the kind of principled professionalism that would serve him well throughout the remainder of his career. The morning when Camilla had requested accommodation for her photography session had seemed like just another routine day in royal service. It had instead become the most significant and challenging experience of James's career, one that had tested his professional judgment, his personal resilience, and his understanding of the complex institution he had committed to serving. The phrase that would be remembered longest from that morning wasn't anything James had said, but rather Camilla's parting comment about palace staff having other priorities when it came to working with certain members of the royal family. Those words had captured something essential about the personal dynamics that could complicate even the most straightforward professional interactions in royal service. Years later, when James looked back on his career in royal protection, the photography incident would stand out as the moment when he truly understood the complexity of his chosen profession and the delicate balance required to succeed in an institution where tradition, protocol, and human nature intersected in ways that couldn't always be predicted or easily managed.